All right, everything is good to go now, and um, I am going to continue with the lecture series we began together a couple weeks ago. And I will say, if the world intrudes, if there are major events in the world, we'll pause and we'll notice and we'll discuss a little bit. And obviously, we're all watching with great concern and some dismay as Russian troops mount on the border of the Ukraine. We'll keep an eye on that, and if they actually enter, we'll take a detour and talk about that stuff. But for now, I want to continue doing what I've been doing with you for the last couple of weeks, which is I hope beginning to set up a framework through which maybe contemporary politics begin to make a little bit more sense. And that starts on the assumption that contemporary politics may feel very strange to many of us right now, may feel, as I might put it, deranged, or that things have just gone crazy. And so today's lecture is going to continue with, in a sense, laying the groundwork for maybe some of the reasons that we feel like the world is not as sane as it was 25 or 50 years ago, by looking at the assumptions that informed the Enlightenment experiment with democracy. And then if we get there, and we've got a lot of territory to cover, and we don't exactly have the constraints of an academic semester, so maybe this will stretch out a little bit, but my plan is to move from Enlightenment to counter Enlightenment today. So if the ideas that inform the resurrection of democracy in the modern world, primarily in the form of representative democracy, derive from and reflect the Enlightenment, in fact, are some of the proudest accomplishments of the Enlightenment, the revival of democratic institutions, do they also build in certain assumptions about human nature that are rooted in the Enlightenment? And if we then look at the philosophical and cultural reaction against the Enlightenment, what's sometimes called the counter Enlightenment, which is a 19th century phenomenon. Aspects of this are, I think, very familiar, even if the labeling or the terminology may not be. For instance, the Romantic movement in literature and poetry and music was in many respects a reaction against what was seen as the overly narrow rationalism of the Enlightenment itself, and so part of the counter-Enlightenment. But in philosophy, I'm going to focus primarily on those who reacted against the French Revolution, and then Nietzsche, and then his 20th century heirs. And there is a connection then between some of the critics of the French Revolution who continued to defend monarchical absolutism and the hegemony of the Catholic Church, Nietzsche himself, and the rise of fascism in the 20th century. And so part of the question here is what do we learn about the rise of or learn from the rise of fascism that might be relevant to today's politics? And we live in a world in which authoritarian strongmen are increasingly ascendant in important parts of the world. And so while we're watching with deep concern about Russia potentially invading the Ukraine, we also need to note that that is in part because we have Vladimir Putin at the helm in Russia, a authoritarian leader who, I think it's fair to say, is trying to shore up his domestic support by engaging in foreign aggression, right? A move that is not completely monopolized by authoritarians, but nevertheless, I think that's part of what's going on there today, and illustrates the way in which authoritarianism is still very much alive, and in fact, in certain countries, threatening to overturn or overtake democracy. So I've been trying to find, I can't promise I'll continue to be able to, a piece of art to illustrate the themes of each week's lecture. And for today, I chose Francisco Goya, and this is a print. And its title is a little ambiguous in Spanish. El sueño de la razón produce monstruosos. Sorry, I think I botched the pronunciation of monsters. But what's ambiguous in the title is whether sueño refers to sleep or dream, and I think that ambiguity is deliberate. So we translate the title as either the sleep or the dream of reason produces monsters. And so if it's the sleep of reason, when reason is inactive, monsters come out. And you could see this as being a critique of the magical thinking of the pre-Enlightenment era. We thought there were witches and demons and sprites and unicorns inhabiting the world with us. And that's because we hadn't used reason to exorcise the world of its monsters. But when reason goes to sleep, the monsters come out. But the other reading is that the dream of reason produces monsters. And so the monstrosity is not just an indication of the absence of reason, but if you will, the flip side of reason, that just as we can't stay awake 24/7, as Freud observed, we need to sleep on a regular basis, take a break from the world. Maybe part of what we need to do is to relax our reason. And when we relax our reason, other things come out. And so the idea of governing ourselves exclusively by reason is unsustainable. And the effort to give reason sole sway over the human mind, human culture, human political institutions produces monstrosities precisely because it is unsustainable. And so a little bit of thinking, I don't know if you're familiar with the Goya prints that this come from, but it's a wonderful collection of prints filled with monsters, by the way. And Goya was very interested in the imagination as an alternative to reason, and that an artist at least could not live by reason alone, but the imagination might take the artist in monstrous places. So with that little bit of background, we're coming to the third week. We still have water to cover. We still have ground to cover, I'm sorry, from the high water mark of confidence in human reason and the long shadow of 18th century constitutionalism from last week. So that is where I'll start, and then get us to the counter-enlightenment. That will then set the stage for 20th and 21st century psychology, cognitive science, efforts to understand in a more scientific and penetrating way what's going on in the human brain when we're thinking, and what that reveals about both the nature and the limits of reason. And so this is going to then be the response to the Enlightenment view. Can we sustain the conception of the reasonable and rational person that our institutions seem to presuppose? Can we sustain that on the basis of what we now know about the human brain, human cognition, and both its powers and limits? And so putting Enlightenment to the test against contemporary cognitive science. And then in the second to last week, we'll focus specifically on the emotions, on another aspect of the human mind, an aspect that seems to be at least super rational, not reducible to rationality, and maybe in fact irrational, not at all rational. I'm not suggesting that it necessarily is, but we need to familiarize ourselves with contemporary theories of the emotions, and in particular the political emotions, which of course are emotions that are riled up by leaders and parties and shared on platforms and at rallies, and the role that emotions play in politics. And again, whether or not the Enlightenment was sufficiently attuned to the roles that emotion play in politics. And then finally, the question of whether we can place democracy on more secure foundations. If we conclude that the Enlightenment was overconfident, that it gave rise to counter-Enlightenment, that fed into fascism, are we replaying that scenario in the early 21st century in a way similar to the way in which it unfolded in the early 20th century? And if so, in light of what we've learned from both history and from more advanced understandings of human cognition and its limits, can we perhaps change our practices, our institutions, other aspects of our culture and society to try to shore up democracy in light of what we have learned? All right, so with a overview out of the way, again, just to refresh your memory, we did a recapitulation, a reconstruction of what I'm calling the dialectic of enlightenment, the passing of the baton from thinker to thinker as these ideas developed from Descartes through Smith to Kant and then to Bentham. And we didn't get all the way there. In particular, we need to spend, some time with Kant, but before we do that, I just want to spend a minute refreshing your memory as to the territory we've covered together. As always, please ask questions as they occur. No need to wait for a pause. I'm not inclined to pause when I'm trying to cover this much material. So we started with Rene Descartes, and I'm just going to point out a couple contrasts here in the big picture. And Descartes' radical doubt, right? He had this dream in his tent when he was 23 years old that he should not take anything for granted, anything anybody else had told him, anything that he had read in a book he was going to get rid of and just rely on his own knowledge, his own mind, his own intelligence, his own reason, and then methodically reconstruct what it is he could believe. And what I want to point out is that enlightenment starts in rather radical doubt, and perhaps it leads to rather radical confidence, and that's an interesting trajectory, right? Descartes ultimately rescues himself from his radical skepticism via a religious lifeline. He thinks the one thing he can be absolutely certain of is that he is thinking, right? And therefore that there is something to him, even if he doesn't know exactly what it is, and that his capacity for thought and the certitude of his existence that it generates then leads to the question, who endowed me, or how am I endowed with thought? And the only credible answer that Descartes can come up with is it must be God. In order for God to do that, he must be, or it must be, omnipotent. In order to coherently conceive of an omnipotent God, I've got to think of him as good. And so then God, who is omnipotent and good, would not allow me to be systematically deceived by my senses or imprisoned in a dungeon by an evil demonic force that is deceiving me. And that Descartes then influences Hobbes, but Hobbes reacts against the religious premise and says, Descartes, you ultimately relied on your faith, not your reason. We cannot establish the religious postulate via reason. And so, as opposed to knowing that we can rely on our senses because we're confident that God imparted them, it put them in us in a way that allows us to understand the world, let's assume that the senses are unreliable, but they're all we've got. We might be often confusing our representation of the world for the world itself. And so the solution to this, in a sense, what we've lost with the decline of Catholic hegemony, the dominance of the Catholic Church, is a human power that is powerful enough to make us all agree, even when our senses are not naturally going to lead us into agreement. And so Hobbes argues for the creation of near absolute sovereignty, what he calls a leviathan, a monstrous, powerful, orderly form of government, but also notes that the only way it's going to succeed is if we all are convinced that rationality requires us to submit to the authority of an all powerful government, and that we express our consent explicitly and knowingly, and that leads to the metaphor of the social contract. From Hobbes, we now move to Locke. And just as with the idea that we move from radical skepticism to confidence, I want to note from Hobbes to Locke, we move from authoritarianism to something approaching liberal democracy. And so there's a what I'm calling a dialectic, a movement of ideas. And that movement often goes kind of from polar opposite to polar opposite. That's the way dialectics operate. And Locke suggests, actually, although all we have is our senses, because we can use our senses to formulate hypotheses about the world and then test those hypotheses, because our senses are somewhat more reliable in discerning certain aspects of the world than other aspects of the world. Shape and volume, for instance, is much more reliable than color. And so we can slowly but surely work up more reliable hypotheses and become more confident that our theories about what the world is like correspond to what the world actually is like. And so we're getting now an idea that philosophy can catch up to the natural sciences. The natural sciences have been doing this, if you will, naively, without a philosophical account of how it works. And Locke provides that philosophical account of why we don't need to be so worried, as Hobbes was, about the unreliability of our senses, as long as we follow scientific method. And then in ways that we're going to go into further, so I won't go into detail right now, Locke also defends parliamentary supremacy on the basis of the idea that because all humans have reason, we all agree on essential moral and practical norms. And the agreement is so precise that we can refer to it as an agreement on natural law. And that the prior agreement on natural law then limits what government can do and indicates in particular that if we are going to set up a government via consent, we will only consent to a government that is bounded, limited to do what we need it to do, not give it absolute authority, and that is accountable to us in an ongoing way, so that we can be sure that after we give all these power to this agency to supervise us, that the power isn't abused, that it remains limited in the way that the contract specified. And so Locke is in many respects the first major thinker of liberal, what we would call democratic government in the Enlightenment tradition. And he has a powerful influence on American constitutionalism. We'll return to some of his political ideas at length later on. We then moved from Locke to Hume, and here now we get a little bit of back and forth on this question about how reliable our senses are, and not only that, the first I think really powerful critique of reason itself within the Enlightenment tradition. And, you know, as opposed to the Catholic critique, which just says the vast majority of humans aren't endowed with reason, David Hume, the great Scottish Enlightenment thinker, in his treatise of human nature says, no, you know, we're all endowed with reason, But let's not get carried away and think that reason is so powerful that it can govern us. As opposed to that, we are governed by our passions. We are governed by what we might call our emotions, or what Adam Smith would call our sentiments, by our hunger and our lust and our desire for beauty and our fear of death. And when you put reason to solving the tasks that the passions set for it, it can get a lot done. But don't get confused in thinking that reason is setting itself its own tasks. That's not the way human psychology operates, Hume declares. And then, in addition to that, right, he says to Locke, by the way, that scientific method you have, because all you're working with is the report of your senses and not the things themselves, right? We all agree with Hume's basic picture that all we have is representations of the world in our mind, right? It's not as if I'm actually seeing the screen in front of me. What I think I'm seeing is actually just a bunch of neurons firing in the visual cortex of my brain. And I interpret that as being things in the world, but it's not really things in the world. And so, even though our scientific theories may make us reasonably confident that we understand the world itself, we can't from that conclude that our predictions are certitudes, right? Our predictions are merely predictions, speculation, that because things have been the way they are in the past, so they will be into the future, right? And without direct access to the nature of the world as such, we can only hope that that will be the case. And that's a little bit weaker, maybe a lot weaker than what Locke had concluded. Finally, as opposed to Locke saying that natural law is inborn with reason, and by the way, that reason is enough to get us to obey the natural law. Well, Hume has already told us reason is the slave of passions. Add to that, then, that a lot of those passions lead us to do things that we probably shouldn't do, right? I put desire on that list of passions, right? And how often do we desire to do the right thing for the right reason, as opposed to desiring maybe something that at some level we know is not the right thing? But if reason is the slave of the passions, maybe we have conscience. Maybe we have something nagging us saying, that's not the right thing to do. But is it going to stop us from doing it? And Hume's answer is a resounding no, that justice is an artificial virtue. It's not rooted in human nature as such. It's imposed on human nature, which is frankly somewhat recalcitrant material. And in order then to get human beings to do what justice requires of them, to keep their promises, not to steal or engage in fraud, to do their duties, you have to set up mechanisms that create incentives to get the human beings to do that. And law and other institutions of social accountability play that role. And that is where Adam Smith picks up from Hume. They are basically contemporaries, both Scotsmen, both part of the so-called Scottish Enlightenment. And although we tend to know Adam Smith as the author of The Wealth of Nations and hence the founder of modern economics, in his own lifetime, his much more influential work was published nearly 20 years earlier, and it was called The Theory of the Moral Sentiments. And in the theory of the moral sentiments, Smith suggested that we are equipped with psychological tendencies, sentiments that tend to make us moral. Among these is sympathy or compassion. We don't like watching others suffer, sentient beings suffer, especially human beings who we tend to identify quite closely with. And perhaps even more importantly, we tend to be sensitive to the way that other people evaluate us. We want to be esteemed or respected in their eyes. And we recognize that if we do things that make other people suffer, we will be subject to the disapprobation or disapproval of other people, right? And that's rooted in their natural sympathy. And to avoid that, then we have to get better at viewing our own conduct through other people's eyes. We're not very good at anticipating what will draw their ire until we start looking at ourselves from their perspective. And ultimately, that leads to impartiality, that we should evaluate our actions not from a self centered point of view, but from an impartial point of view, the perspective that Smith famously calls the perspective of an impartial spectator, but that we are led fairly naturally through the processes of early childhood development to come to understand implicitly the need to evaluate ourselves impartially. And by the way, we get some assistance because even if we start saying, oh, I better not look at it just from my point of view. Of course, it looks good to steal my neighbor's candy when nobody's looking and he'll never notice. Wait, what if I get caught? What will he think of me? He likes me right now. Will he still like me if he knows that I'm the one raiding his cookie jar? Right. And in addition to then developing the idea, I better view it from his perspective and from an impartial point of view, we start developing rules that help us to do this, like do not steal, or stealing is bad, right? And so the rules that Hume is suggesting need to be imposed on us, Smith is suggesting actually emerge over the process of normal childhood human development, right? And not necessarily in exactly the form we have them. Culture helps us, but culture isn't just imposing on recalcitrant material. Culture is guiding a process of natural development. And so I hope you see the kind of whipsawing here, right? Locke with a relatively optimistic view of human nature, Hume with a more pessimistic view, Smith coming back with a more optimistic view. This is the debate that the Enlightenment thinkers are having. And as we will see, it's a debate that actually comes to be inflected in various ways in the debates around 18th century constitutionalism. Now, in part, what Smith is suggesting is that social order, the idea of reliable morality, and I just need to say a little bit more about this for a moment. Smith is living in the early periods of the development of the market economy, and maybe more importantly for his moral theory, urbanization. People are moving to cities. And if you live in a small town, right, in a sense, the work of enforcing the artificial virtue of justice is assisted by the fact that everybody knows you and knows your parents. And if you steal your neighbor's cookies, they're going to tell your parents, and then everybody's going to look at you at church on Sunday or when you go to school and say, there's that thief, right? So there's an accountability of visibility that comes with living stably in a small setting. But Smith is living during the era of urbanization. Millions of people are moving to London. Hundreds of thousands are moving to Glasgow and Edinburgh. That's where the economic action is. And by the way, they're being turned out of their lands by the nobility who all of a sudden have decided they want it to themselves. And how can we rely on people who have no prior acquaintance with us and who we have no reliable sustained interaction with? How can we rely on them being good and doing right? And Smith suggests, well, because morality is an emergent social order. We don't need all this enforcement. It naturally grows up on its own. And you see something similar then with the market economy. That is to say, there is a human is basically right. We are by nature desirous creatures. We're self-loving creatures is the language that Smith uses. We might say self-interested, but he's a little bit more in the sentiments or passions camp. And so he says it's self-love. We want things for ourselves. And guess what? Society can harness that selfishness and make it work for the good of all. And so we don't need to fundamentally reshape human nature, just put it in the right structural setting. And I want to underline that idea for a moment because I think it's actually going to be very important as we get further in this class, that maybe we don't need to be so clear about what human nature as such is, but what form and shape human potentials take in different social contexts. You put selfish humans in a context where they cannot trade and barter in order to better their situation, and maybe they will steal and plunder. But if you put them in a situation with a market that allows them to engage in exchanges that make everybody better, then there's a healthy outlet for their selfishness. And that aspect of human nature, as opposed to needing to be stamped out or highly regulated, becomes socially constructive. And again, right, that there's a back and forth here. How much is our selfishness something we need to be really worried about and really on top of, as opposed to let it run its course as long as the right social institutions are in place. All right, so now, drum roll please, we get finally to Immanuel Kant. And Kant is a great German philosopher, arguably one of the greatest modern philosophers, and his work covers the full range of modern philosophical issues. He works in metaphysics, he works in epistemology, he works on aesthetics, things to do with art and beauty and the sublime, and he works in practical philosophy as well, moral and political and ethical philosophy. And in each of these fields, he writes profoundly systematic and dramatically new works. And he, as important as he is philosophically, he is boring personally. He basically never left his provincial town in what we now think of as Germany, Königsberg, and was just a university professor his whole life. And at around age 50, Kant encountered Hume's ideas, and he famously wrote that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumbers. He had basically been confident that science was getting us to an accurate picture of the universe, and then Hume came along and said, wait a sec, if everything is mediated by the senses, and if the senses are unreliable, if all knowledge is, as Kant put it at one point, a posteriori, it only comes from experience, then it's only as reliable as our experience is, and our experience is notoriously unreliable. So to solve this challenge that Kant receives, especially from Hume, Kant starts a program in what he calls critical philosophy. And before I get into the full scope of this program, I want to talk about what Kant means by critical. And in particular, he titles his three most systematic works critiques. Often we now call them the first, second, and third critique: the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment. And by saying critique, what Kant means is that we have to use reason to understand itself, to study itself, to plumb its own depths, to detect its own capacities and limits. That in one sense, Hobbes, Descartes, Locke, Hume are all right. Reason is all we have. But because reason doesn't just study the world, but also can be turned in upon itself, and because unlike when we use reason to study the world and it's mediated by the senses, when we use reason to study itself, we can get more certain knowledge because there's not the mediation of the senses into some foreign object. We are using our own internal capacity for thought to figure out what we think. We are thinking about thinking. We can come to understand with confidence what reason teaches us about reason. And at the same time, there is the claim. So reason is its own tribunal. It determines its own power and limit. And at the same time, there is the claim that no authority, no idea, no matter how holy or hallowed, not our religion or our king or our favorite poetry, can be exempted from the critical scrutiny of reason. Anything that claims to be exempt thereby discredits itself. And so if there's a definition of the age of enlightenment for Kant, it probably is the age of critique. I'll come back to that a little bit more. But this idea that no authority is exempt, and that includes reason itself. Now, here's then the conclusion, and I'm not going to go into the details. We'd have to spend months looking at texts, but the broad conclusion of Kant's critical philosophy is that reason's self-study, the effort to turn it back in upon itself and understand what it does, how it works, what rules it obeys, reveals the rules that govern its operation in the realm of knowledge, of morals, and aesthetic judgment. And that those rules are not like experience. They are things that we can be absolutely certain of. And if you remember back to what I said to you about Hume last week, Hume had said, well, I can observe the match striking flint and the flame that results, and that seems to always happen. But that doesn't mean that just because those two events are constantly conjoined, that I can actually see the causal connection between them. And so how do I know that the next time I do it, it will happen? That's just a speculative claim about which I really can't have the kind of confidence, the certainty that scientific theory and everyday common sense tell me I should have, right? And Kant responds by saying to Hume, in a sense, you're looking in the wrong place. As opposed to thinking causation is a thing out there in the world that connects sulfur and flint, it's in here. The category of causation is one of the structuring ideas of the human understanding as such. Let's take the idea of walking. or the process of walking. When we walk, what we're doing, among other things, is pushing our foot against the ground on the supposition that that will cause me, if done in the right way, to propel myself forward. And if I did not start from the organizing assumption that there is causal efficacy in the world, pushing my foot down pushes me forward, then I would be so at sea in the world. I couldn't even walk, right? I couldn't put my clothes on. I couldn't get out of bed. I couldn't do anything. And so we have to recognize that causation is not a property of the world. It is a property of human understanding that the understanding imposes on our experience of the world, whatever the world is like. And therefore, when we turn reason in upon itself, we get conclusions that reveal the rules by which reason operates. And whatever the world is like, we can be certain that we're going to continue to experience it as governed by causation, because our experience of the world wouldn't be coherent without that understanding. Our understanding can't operate in the world without imposing that category or concept on it. So the concepts actually structure our experience of the world, and we can be certain about them. And Kant referred to this as his Copernican revolution. And here is the way in which it's similar to Copernicus's discovery. Copernicus lived in a world in which everybody thought the sun circled the earth, right? And he, in a sense, could wake up every morning and watch the sun rise and then move across the sky and go down. Of course, that's what the world is doing. And Copernicus, through some complex calculations and observations, said actually that's not what's going on. What's going on is that the earth is spinning, and that gives us the impression that the sun is moving around, but actually, no, heliocentrism, the sun is the center, we're actually orbiting the sun. And similarly, Kant says, we want to think causation is out there in the world, but actually the best we can do is to recognize that causation is a structuring category of the human understanding without which we cannot understand the world. And so that gives you a sense, just one of the ways in which Kant solves some of the problems that Hume passed along to him. I'm going to say more about moral and political philosophy as well, but he does believe that we can turn reason in upon itself and also discover rules that govern us in terms of our morality and our politics. So, with that idea of Kant's critical philosophy in mind, I want now to turn to an essay, a relatively minor publication from Kant, actually published in a newspaper in 1784, as Kant was really rising in stature and fame. And he was responding to somebody else who wrote an essay called What is Enlightenment? And Kant entitles his essay an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? And he offers the following quite concise definition. He says it's humankind's, he says mankind's emergence from self-incurred minority, being a minor. I'm going to say immaturity is maybe a better way to translate this. And the idea is that when you're a minor, when you're immature, you can't govern yourself, you can't reason for yourself. But as you come into maturity, you no longer need to be directed. by your parents. You start making up your mind about what matters to you and how you want to lead your life. And that just as this is a natural stage in the healthy development of every human being, we become mature and then we start thinking for ourselves as opposed to being told what to do. Kant is suggesting that in his lifetime, humanity is for the first time thinking for itself, making use of its own understanding and reason without direction from another. And so, one of the things that Kant is very much focused on here is religious institutions, churches, and especially the Catholic Church's um, view of humanity as being sheep and the church as being the shepherd. That's a very, in the contemporary language, infantilizing view, right? And Kant is suggesting with the Reformation, with the Enlightenment, humanity is saying no, not only to the Catholic Church, but to any religious or political or social institution that says, you don't need to solve this problem for yourself. We'll take care of it for you. That is treating you like a child or an infant. And as opposed to that, humanity in the 18th century is saying, we will think for ourselves. No, thank you to the Pope or the Prince who tells us that we're not capable of that. And then he suggests a motto for the Enlightenment: dare to understand. He puts it in Latin, and he says, this is in part a product of the spirit of rationally valuing oneself. Why is it that we have the capacity for reason? Well, because it allows us to think for ourselves. That makes us potentially ends in ourselves, creatures who can understand our own value and indicate how we're going to lead our lives in order to lead valuable lives. And so the calling of each individual is to think for themselves. This requires courage. In a sense, it's much easier to be under the tutelage of an institution that tells you what to do. You don't have to do the arduous work of making up your own mind and then potentially suffer from the social consequences of not doing what the people around you want to do because you come to the conclusion that it doesn't make sense. But if you think for yourself, you will be mature, you will be rational, you will have what Kant called dignity that comes from possessing reason and using that reason to set your ends for yourself. And so, in a previous era, the way in which we expressed esteem of particular human beings was to say they have honor. But honor was monopolized by a very few human beings. Kant says, let's honor no one. Let's make sure that no matter who you are, your authority does not exempt you from critique, but let's grant dignity to everyone because everyone has an equal share of human reason, a sufficient share at least to think for themselves, reason for themselves, figure out what they want to do with their own lives. Now, how does enlightenment actually occur? It occurs when this is a structured cultural practice. And this is what Kant called the public use of reason. And by this, he meant primarily a vital public sphere. And remember, in Kant's era, Facebook had not been invented yet, right? The way in which you engaged in the public sphere was by publishing articles in newspapers or circulating your own pamphlets and books. It was a literary public sphere. And so when he refers to the public use of reason, he's really referring to people arguing, criticizing, and critiquing in newspapers, books, publications. And when a society is characterized by a sustained culture of argumentation, it is an enlightened society, not because it's figured out the answers to all the questions it asks itself, right? Kant suggests enlightenment is a process, not an end. It's the process of continuously subjecting to critique all claims to knowledge and authority. And on this basis, Kant concludes that his own era is an era of enlightenment. So, with that in mind, and I want to really turn to the practical philosophy of Kant. And this is expressed in a number of works, most important of which, the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, which is published in 1785, the Critique of Practical Reason, published a few years later, and then the Metaphysics of Morals, almost a decade later. And the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals contains the essence of Kant's moral philosophy, the critique of practical reason, the effort to turn reason in upon itself, but now not to see how we know things about the world, but how we know about ourselves and what reason requires of us in terms of the way in which we treat each other. And then finally, the Metaphysics of Morals contains a very detailed account of what our duties and obligations to each other are in both the moral and political worlds. And the whole project starts from something that he believes he establishes in the groundwork, and that is that reason has the capacity for self-legislation and motivation. This goes back to Locke's idea that when we use reason, we discover regularities of practical ethics that Locke calls natural law. And Kant goes a step further than Locke in suggesting not only do we discover this through reason, we legislate it through reason, and that reason contains sufficient structure, specific enough rules for reasoning through that question. What do I owe to each other? What do I owe to myself? How does my society need to be constituted in order to be just? Enough structure in the answering of those questions that we will all come to the same conclusions and be able then to use our reason to generate the principles that should guide us if we want to be moral. And in particular, Kant offers in the groundwork 4, 5, depending on how you count it, formulations for a fundamental moral principle that he believes reason contains, discovers through its own self-scrutiny, and he calls these formulations of the categorical imperative. And so this is all meant to be really equivalent, just different ways of coming at what reason tells us to do if we want to be moral. So the first formula is sometimes called the formula of the universal law. And this formula says, act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So go back to the question, when my neighbor's not looking, should I invade her cookie jar? And Kant suggests, well, what you need to ask yourself is, what's the implicit principle you're operating on, the maxim? That implicit principle seems to be steal when you can get away with it. Well, what makes you special? Is there something about you that suggests that you should have your own distinct morality that is different from everybody else's? And Kant thinks if we think about that carefully, we will see that there's nothing that distinguishes us. And then you need to ask, so if you think it's okay for you to steal your neighbor's cookies, how are you going to feel if she steals your cookies? Right? And you know, pretty soon you're going to recognize, wait a second, our whole ability to live with security and some degree of reciprocity and mutual appreciation for each other depends on the idea that we don't do this, right? And so if I made my idea, I'll steal when she's not looking, a universal law, society would be pretty awful, pretty terrible. It would look like Hobbes' state of nature. I can't will it to be a universal law. A second formula, and this is quite different but related, is what's called the formula of humanity, or the formula of humanity as an end in itself. And here Kant says we need to act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, never only as a means. And what this formula of the categorical imperative reflects is the idea that each of us has practical reason. That practical reason allows us to legislate for ourselves. And what it allows us to do in particular is to treat our own lives as intrinsically important, right? That this is not, just, I'm not a plaything, I'm not a pawn, I'm not something for you to use as you want. I am a person with my own reason, and therefore with my own ends, with a serious purpose in my life. And yes, you may encounter me when I'm working at the drugstore, and you may need me to give you your medicine, and that's a means to your end. But you also have to treat me with respect. And that means not just being nice to me, but making sure that I'm getting a living wage, etc., for doing the work that I'm doing that assists you in accomplishing your ends, right? So treat every human being as an end in themselves. Third formula that I'm going to focus on is the formula of autonomy. And here, what Kant is suggesting is that reason is legislative for us. It allows us to make rules for ourselves. He says, act so that your will could regard itself as giving universal law through all its maxims. And I hope you can see that the first and the third formula are pretty close to each other, right? Act as if your will was a law, act as if your will was making that law. And in a sense, here Kant is suggesting your will is making a law for yourself. At least you're telling yourself how to act to be consistent. You need to not just act now on the basis of impulse. Boy, I really want those cookies. I'll run over to my neighbor's house and grab them. But should you do that every time you have a hankering for cookies, right? And not only that, it's not just a law for you if you're not special, right? That's what the first formula has captured. If you're not so different from other human beings that you get to obey your own law, then in making a law for yourself, in governing yourself by your rationality, you should attempt to do it in a way that you would want every other person to do the same thing. And so a society of autonomous persons, of people who make their own rules, will actually be a society of convergence, because reason will tell us to act in the same way. And then the final formulation is the formula of the kingdom of ends. And here Kant says, act so that your will can regard itself as making a universal law for a kingdom of ends. And by that, he means a kingdom in which every person is treated as equal, as inherently dignified, as therefore an end in themselves and never merely a means to anybody else's ends. And again, I think you can see the connection between the second and the fourth formulation. And I know I'm running out of time. Let me just conclude very briefly by saying to you that what Kant concludes politically on the basis of this moral philosophy, right? The moral philosophy says we turn reason in upon itself. What we get out of it is actually some fairly concrete and demanding principles. And now the question is, how should we structure our society if every person is going to be treated as autonomous, as an end in themselves, and according to universal principles? And Kant thinks there's only one answer to that, and that's that government needs to be, quote, republican. That is to say, every person needs to have the capacity, the equal opportunity to influence the law. And that requires then what we would call a democracy. And so Kant in his own life is referred to as the laughing Jacobin, right? Because he's such a big supporter of the French Revolution. And there's this idea that the French Revolution, the American Revolution, that's Enlightenment working itself out in political practice. And that's what Kant thinks philosophy and reason demand of us. All right, I will stop there. I know I didn't get to counter Enlightenment, but I really got us a long way through the Enlightenment dialectic that I'm trying to reconstruct. Let me hear. What do you think? What are your questions? What are your thoughts? I'm happy to start. And Flossie is quick on the draw. Go ahead, and then I'll come to you, Marion.
I have to share an experience of teaching at a place called Continuation High School before I really hit the jackpot of Lincoln and Lowell. And we called it Con High because the kids who came out of reform school or juvie they were required to come to school. And they were a remarkable bunch of kids. Some of them would be termed incorrigible. Some of them outwitted their teachers. And one day we were having a discussion about what constituted stealing, what was stealing. And we began with the proposition that some of our own students had decided that they wanted what they called a joyride. And there was a car sitting there across the street and they took it for a ride. Was that stealing? Absolutely not. Well, because it was there, they could take it. And then they might return it. And if they didn't return it, well, their intentions were not to take it forever. They wanted a joyride. And it wasn't until I asked out, you have been given a gift. You just graduated from high school and you have a beautiful Chevrolet coupe. And somebody takes it for a joyride. Is that stealing? Absolutely, that was stealing. It was mine. And I couldn't get them past that moment. If it's mine, somebody takes it, it's stealing. It needed a little more concern. I wanted to share that.
And thank you for the story. You put me in mind of my uncle who taught in a perhaps similar high school in Richmond, California, from the mid 60s until like 10 years ago. And for his first maybe decade there, he had I think 1964 VW Bug convertible. And it was widely known and passed along through generations of students that the ignition was such that you could turn it on with a screwdriver. and so my uncle had his VW Bug taken for a joyride many times by the high school students there until some unfortunate souls went a little too crazy and rolled it. And that was the end of that VW Bug. But having said all of that, in philosophy, right, and Hume starts us down this path, right, that we need to view ourselves not from our narrow, selfish perspective, but to ask ourselves, what will other people think about us, right? And because we're actually sensitive to what other people think about us, both Hume and Smith. And it's especially Smith who says, in essence, others are mirrors, and we see ourselves in the mirror of the other. And ultimately, we come to internalize what other people think about us, and we want their approbation, we want their approval. That this starts a process of natural, what we now call decentering, not making yourself the center of all of your thought. Well, that's my car, so you can't steal it, but I'm just taking a joyride, right? You know, that's a highly centered point of view. But if it occurs naturally that we decenter ourselves, or if the idea of universality is there in human reason, if we will only turn it in upon itself to notice, then maybe it's not as hard to get us from the idea, well, you know, the golden rule, if you're saying that joyriding is okay for you, then why isn't it okay when they do it to you? That's one of the big processes of human development, human moral development, that Locke and Hume and Smith and Kant all think in different ways tends to occur somewhat naturally, and then culture helps us to get all the way there. Marion, go ahead.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that this seems so remarkably simple. If Kant were living today instead of in the 18th century, he would have to change his definition a little bit, what he means by people. It would have to include women, it would include people of all colors, it would include people of all economic levels, and then we could all have our ends met, and there wouldn't be any more wars, and perhaps Putin could be convinced that what should be done in the country that he's got his eyes on would depend on their citizens and their votes rather than his wish for enlarging the Soviet Union again. So it seems like such a simple notion to just agree with what was said in the end of the 1700s.
And you know, I sometimes am of the opinion if everybody just read Kant, we would all get along a lot better. But I think that might be a bit too facile, right? And in the sense that, you know, we're not, in fact, always governed, even when we're convinced, by what we think morality is. And that's probably the understatement of the day, right? You know, so often we do things not because they're moral, but because they're in our interest, or they cater to our temptations or our vanity, etc. Right? And so human nature is complex. But I think if Kant were alive today, the thing I would add is he couldn't suggest that everything that he recommends to us comes merely from reason turning itself in upon itself. And so there's great nobility and power in Kant's moral philosophy, but there's also supreme confidence that everybody is going to reason in the same way and find in their mind exactly what Kant thinks is there. And let's just remember that Kant was a pietistic Protestant Christian, and that there appears to be in his moral and political philosophy some translation of some of his religious ideas into secular moral philosophy. That doesn't mean we should be entirely suspicious of them. It might be that his religion had some ideas that actually secular reason can reconstruct, refound in ways that are no longer dependent upon their religious foundation. But having said that, you know, we might be a little suspicious that Kant is taking ideas that come out of his cultural moment and suggesting that they are universal moral principles. We add to that in the 21st century, we know a lot more. And so we know that what Kant thought in his racist anthropology is not true, right? That actually what he's saying about all human beings, he actually went back and said, well, what I really mean is all Europeans. Oops, right? We know that's a racist idea now. And by the way, when he said all mankind, he meant the gendering of that term. And again, we know better in the 21st century. And yes, he was a classist as well. He thought that the unpropertied shouldn't have any rights, any political rights, I should say, right? And so, you know, when we put all of that together, we begin to think not only would we need to correct some stuff of Kant's, but we'd also need a more scientifically informed account of what reason is like. It might not just be that my intuitions informed by my culture and my religion get me a clear picture of what reason is like. We might need cognitive science. We might need psychology. We might need a better understanding of the way in which cognition is structured by the brain, and as it turns out, parts of the body too. And once we have all of that, then we might be in a position to say, well, Kant, you got some stuff right and some stuff we've learned better. Not just to correct you about what universality means, but also about what reason sees when it studies itself. Thank you, Mary. And you've anticipated very nicely where we're going in future classes. So that's great also. Anyone else with the comment before we wrap things up today? All right, well, it's fun to be able to see. I'm not sure I'm seeing any chairs in it, but I see a room open on the floor. Yeah, so at least there's a place you can go if you want to be together. I hope things continue to go smoothly there, and I will look forward to seeing you all next week. Thank you very much. Take care, everybody. Bye, guys.
Thank you, David.
My pleasure as always. Take care. Be well. Bye-bye.